Lena Thompson felt the familiar thrum of anxiety rise in her chest as the red and blue lights flashed in her rearview mirror. She didn't need to look at her speedometer to know she had been going a little too fast. But today it seemed that everything was rushing at her too quickly, as if the universe had decided it was time to remind her of all the things she couldn't outrun. She had been through this before, but never in this small town where she had hoped to finally find some peace after years of service and struggle. Lena took a deep breath and pulled over to the side of the road. Her worn car sighed as it came to a halt. She glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the police officer stepping out of his vehicle, a tall man with sharp features and a uniform that seemed just a little too pristine for the quiet street they were on. Lena straightened in her seat and tried to steady her hands. Her mind drifted to the years she had spent in the desert, the heat, the dust, the chaos, and how now everything seemed so far away yet so close, as if she were still there. She couldn't help but feel that it would always be a part of her, even here in this moment when it seemed so trivial. But it wasn't trivial, not really. The officer approached the window, and Lena greeted him with a soft smile, a gesture that had become instinctual over the years. She knew how to appear calm, even when she wasn't. And today, that was all she had to cling to. The officer asked if she knew why she had been pulled over, and Lena nodded, even though she wasn't sure of the exact speed she had been going. But she had seen the signs and knew the rules, so she answered with a quiet yes. The officer began explaining the fine he was going to issue for speeding, and Lena felt the weight of it immediately, as though the fine were another reminder of how little room she had left for error. She glanced at the ticket in his hand and felt her stomach twist. A fine for a small mistake felt like the world was pushing down on her in ways she could never explain. Lena knew the cost of her service, her sacrifices, her medals had never been enough to shield her from the realities of civilian life. No one knew what it was like to return home after years of war, to find that the things you had fought for, the things you had hoped for, were no longer there, and all you were left with were empty streets and jobs that didn't understand the gaps in your resume or the scars on your mind. She tried to remind herself that this wasn't the officer's fault, that he wasn't the one who had made her life so difficult, but it was hard to separate the person in front of her from the system that made her feel invisible and forgotten. The officer handed her the ticket and asked her to sign. She did so with a steady hand, but inside she could feel the weight of it pressing down on her. Even more, she knew she wouldn't be able to pay this fine, and the thought of it made her chest tighten. She had barely enough to get by each month, and now she would have to figure out how to add this to the list of things she couldn't afford. The officer didn't know the story behind her face, the years of service, the pain that lingered in her every step, and she wondered if he ever would, or if anyone would ever really know. The courthouse smelled of old wood and paper, the kind of scent that made Lena feel even smaller than she already was. She had been to court before, but today was different. Today, she wasn't fighting for her future or her place in the world. She was fighting for something much more personal. The judge's gavel would decide whether she was going to drown in a sea of debt or somehow stay afloat for a little longer. But deep down, she knew it wouldn't matter much either way, because she had already lost so much in her life, and a fine wasn't going to change that. It wasn't going to heal the wounds that ran deeper than anything money could fix. Lena sat in the waiting area, her legs stiff beneath her. As she glanced around the room, it was a mix of people. Some looked like they had been here before, others like they had no idea what to expect, but all of them seemed to share the same anxious energy, and Lena could feel it too. Her stomach churned as the minutes dragged on the clock on the wall ticked away, and every sound felt like a reminder of how much time had slipped away from her. Already she had served her country, she had saved lives in a foreign land, and now here she was trying to make sense of a life that didn't seem to fit anymore. When her name was called, Lena stood and walked toward the courtroom, her shoes clicking softly against the floor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wasn't sure what to expect when she stepped inside, but what she found was a man behind a high desk, looking down at her, his sharp features framed by the heavy wood of the judge's bench. He didn't look at her like she was someone who had served in a war, or someone who had seen things that no one should ever have to see. He looked at her like she was just another person, another name on a list of people who had broken the rules and needed to be punished. Judge Richard Hale didn't waste any time as he glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, his eyes barely lifted as he spoke. "Miss Thompson, speeding violation. You've been issued a fine. You're expected to pay it immediately." His voice was firm, as if this was just another routine case, and Lena had to swallow the bitterness that rose in her throat. She didn't know if he was even listening or if he cared, but his indifference was like a slap in the face, and it stung more than she could have prepared for. Lena opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She had spent so much of her life keeping her pain hidden away, hoping that it would just go unnoticed, hoping that no one would ask the hard questions. But in this moment, she couldn't stay silent. She had to make him see her for what she was, not just a woman with a speeding ticket, but a person who had fought for her country and now struggled to fight for her future. "I'm a veteran," she said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it. "I served in Iraq. I've been through things that most people can't even imagine." She could feel the weight of the words as they left her lips. She wasn't sure if he understood or even cared, but she had to say it anyway. The judge glanced up for a moment and then back at his paperwork. He didn't seem moved or even interested. "The fine still stands," he said without a second thought, and Lena's heart dropped. She had tried to make him see her, but it felt like she was invisible, like nothing mattered, and she was just another name on the docket, another case to dismiss. She left the courtroom feeling defeated, but also strangely determined. The fine wasn't the worst thing that had happened to her, but it was another reminder of how far she still had to go, how much further she had to fight just to be seen. Lena Thompson wasn't always this woman who sat in a courtroom, her heart heavy with unspoken words. Once she had been a different person, a soldier, a fighter, someone who felt invincible. When she enlisted in the army, she was just out of high school, full of dreams and patriotism. She had been eager to serve, eager to make a difference, and eager to escape the limits of a small town that had always felt too confining. She remembered how proud her mother had been when she signed the papers, how her father had shaken her hand and told her he was proud to have a daughter who was willing to fight for her country. But none of them knew what it would cost her. The day Lena arrived in Iraq was a blur. She had never seen anything like it. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with dust, and the constant sound of distant explosions became the soundtrack of her life. She was assigned to a combat medic unit, and though she had trained for it, nothing could prepare her for the reality of being on the front lines. She remembered the first time she had to save someone's life, a young soldier who had stepped on an IED. The blast had sent him flying, but Lena had been there in an instant, her hands steady as she performed triage. She had done it without thinking, her training kicking in as she worked to stabilize him, even as her heart pounded in her chest. It wasn't until later, when she was sitting alone in the quiet of her tent, that the weight of what had happened hit her. She had saved a life. But it wasn't just him she had saved. It was a part of herself, too, a part of her humanity that was still intact, still there. As the months passed, Lena became accustomed to the chaos, to the pain, to the constant fear of what could happen next. She earned her medals, the Bronze Star for courage under fire, the Purple Heart for the injuries she had sustained during a firefight, but they never felt like enough. The recognition never filled the void inside of her, the void left by the trauma she had endured. When the day came for her to return home, she had thought that everything would be different. She had imagined reuniting with her family, settling back into civilian life, maybe even finding a job. But the transition was harder than she had anticipated. The nightmares plagued her, visions of the battlefield, the sounds of explosions, the faces of the soldiers she couldn't save. She tried to move forward, tried to put on a brave face, but nothing felt real anymore. Her old life, the one she had left behind, felt like a distant memory, like a part of someone else's story. Finding work was another struggle. Her service had left her with scars, both physical and emotional, and no one seemed to understand. No one saw the woman who had once been a hero. They only saw someone who couldn't fit into a world that didn't know how to care for her. She had tried different jobs, waiting tables, working at a local grocery store, but the pain lingered, never leaving her. She had been to therapy, but the counseling didn't seem to help. And now, as she sat in the courtroom, facing the judge who couldn't even look her in the eye, it all felt like a cruel joke. The sacrifices, the blood, the years of service, they didn't mean anything here. She was just another person with a ticket to pay. Lena wasn't sure how much longer she could keep pretending. She wasn't sure how much longer she could fight this battle on her own. But for some reason, she wasn't ready to give up yet. There had to be more to her story than this. Lena's throat tightened as she stood there in the courtroom, the harsh white lights overhead blurring her vision. She could feel the weight of the judge's gaze as though it were pinning her to the spot, forcing her to shrink into herself. The coldness in Judge Hale's voice had taken her by surprise. She had expected something more, perhaps a flicker of empathy, or at least the chance to explain herself. But there was nothing but formality, nothing but the routine of a man used to passing judgment without ever asking the questions that mattered. "I'm a veteran," Lena said, the words coming out in a rush, almost as if she had been holding them back for years. She could feel the room shift as she spoke, a soft murmur rippling through the air. Her voice faltered but didn't break. "I served in Iraq. I was a medic." She paused, trying to hold her ground, trying to make her presence known in the vast emptiness of the courtroom. "I saved lives there. I've seen things, done things." Judge Hale's eyes briefly flickered up from the paperwork he was still studying. For the briefest of moments, Lena thought she saw something shift in him, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a hint of something like recognition, but just as quickly, the moment was gone. He cleared his throat and looked down again. "That's not relevant here, Miss Thompson," he replied, his voice steady and emotionless. "You still need to pay the fine. The law is the law." Lena felt her heart pound in her chest, and for a second, she thought she might collapse. He'd heard her, but he hadn't really heard her. The words she had spoken, the weight of her experiences, they meant nothing to him. The fine wasn't the issue. It never had been. It was the cold, indifferent system that reduced her to just another number, just another name on a docket. She had been to war. She had fought for her country. She had sacrificed, and yet none of that mattered in this moment. In this courtroom, she was just another woman who had broken the law and was now paying the price. Lena fought to keep her composure as she nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, the words tasting like sand in her mouth. She wasn't sure what hurt more, the judge's lack of understanding or the fact that she had expected anything different. She thought she had given everything in the service of her country, but here, in the eyes of the law, none of that mattered. There was no room for context, no room for the human story that lay beneath the surface. It was as if the judge saw only a ticket and a fine, not the woman who had once been a hero on the front lines. As Lena left the courtroom, the sound of the gavel echoing in her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling of being invisible. The world outside the courthouse was cold and indifferent, just as it had been in that sterile room. She had hoped that by speaking up, by revealing the truth of who she was, someone would understand. Someone would see the weight of what she had endured, the years of service and sacrifice, but the judge had dismissed her with a simple ruling. The fine still stood. She stepped out into the crisp afternoon air, the wind biting at her skin, and for a moment, she just stood there, looking at the ground. She wanted to scream, but the only sound that came out was a shaky exhale. The anger, the frustration, the sense of being unheard, it all built up inside her, a pressure she didn't know how to release. But as much as it hurt, she couldn't allow herself to break. She had fought too long, too hard, to let this system define her. Lena straightened her back, lifted her chin, and walked away from the courthouse, though she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just the fine she was walking away from. It was the unspoken recognition she had always longed for. Weeks passed, and the sting of that courtroom visit never really left Lena. It stayed with her, like a heavy stone lodged deep in her chest. Each time she paid a bill she could barely afford or had to skip another doctor's appointment, the weight of that fine, those cold words from Judge Hale, seemed to follow her. It wasn't just the money, it was the feeling of being invisible, of fighting a battle no one understood. And yet, through it all, there was a small part of her that held on to something deeper than the bitterness. She wasn't sure what it was, but she knew she had to keep going, had to keep fighting, even if no one else saw her struggle. One afternoon, Lena found herself at a local veterans event at the community center. She had been reluctant to attend at first. She wasn't sure she had the energy to be around people, especially people who hadn't lived her life. The war veterans who had served with her had all gone on to bigger cities, looking for opportunities that didn't seem to exist for someone like her. And the others, the ones who hadn't been in combat, didn't seem to understand what it was like to come home and find everything broken. But today, something tugged at her. She had put on a simple black dress, something that wasn't military issued, and she slipped her medals into a small pin on her collar. As she entered the building, the room buzzed with conversation. It was a gathering of men and women who had served, some from wars long past, others more recent. They wore their uniforms proudly, and even though they didn't know each other, there was an unspoken connection between them. They understood. Lena made her way to a seat toward the back of the room, hoping to stay unnoticed. She was no longer a combat medic, no longer the woman who saved lives on the front lines. Here, she was just another veteran, another face in the crowd, a woman trying to find a place for herself in a world that no longer seemed to need her. But as the speeches began, something unexpected happened. The door to the room opened, and in walked Judge Hale. He was here, standing in front of a crowd he had never expected to meet, his stern demeanor contrasting sharply with the warmth of the event. He was there to speak, to address the veterans and show his support, but Lena didn't know why she felt a knot tighten in her stomach when she saw him. She had never thought she would see him outside the courtroom, and certainly never in a place like this. He started his speech, droning on about his admiration for the sacrifices made by veterans and his commitment to supporting them. Lena could feel his eyes scanning the crowd, but she didn't expect him to notice her. Not in a room full of soldiers, each of them with their own stories, their own battles. But then, his gaze lingered for a moment longer than usual, and their eyes met. She could tell in that instant that he recognized her, the woman he had fined for speeding, the one whose story he hadn't cared to hear. For a split second, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or maybe guilt. But before she could decide, he continued speaking, his words now seeming hollow to her. As the crowd dispersed after the event, Judge Hale made his way toward Lena. She didn't know what to expect, but when he stopped in front of her, his usual stern expression softened. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice quieter than before. "I didn't realize. I didn't know." Lena met his gaze, not sure how to respond. There was no anger left in her now, just a weariness that seemed to have settled into her bones. "I didn't expect you to," she said softly. He took a step closer, looking at her more intently this time, and for the first time, Lena saw him truly see her, not just as the woman who had broken the law, but as the person who had served, who had sacrificed. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his words carrying more weight than she had expected. "I didn't understand, but now, I think I do." Lena stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure how to respond to Judge Hale's apology. His words were unexpected, but there was something in his voice, something genuine. It wasn't the kind of apology she had ever expected to hear from a man like him, especially after the cold dismissal in the courtroom. It was as if the man who had fined her was no longer the same person standing before her. She could see the subtle shift in his demeanor, as though he had only just realized how much he had missed. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of voices and footsteps from the crowd dying down in the background filled the silence. Lena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say. She had never been the kind of person to seek pity or forgiveness, especially not from someone who had once treated her like an offender, someone whose story wasn't worth hearing. But here he was, the man who had been so quick to judge, now standing in front of her with an apology that seemed to change everything and nothing all at once. "I didn't expect you to understand," Lena finally said, her voice steady but tinged with a quiet bitterness that she hadn't meant to show. "And I'm not sure I can forgive you just because you've decided you made a mistake. That's fine. It's more than just money. You don't know what it's like to live in a world that doesn't see you anymore. You don't know what it's like to give everything and then come home to nothing." Judge Hale's face softened, and for the first time, Lena saw the man who had once been so authoritative, now grappling with the weight of his own realization. "I can't begin to imagine what you've been through," he said quietly. "But I'm sorry. I was wrong to treat you like just another name on a docket. I didn't know. I didn't ask." Lena wasn't sure if she wanted to hear his words anymore. She wasn't sure if they could erase the sting of the judgment, the way he had dismissed her so easily. But in this moment, she saw something new in him, a glimmer of human connection, of humility she hadn't expected. She had expected nothing but indifference from the system, and yet here he was, a man who had the power to decide her fate, offering her something she had never gotten from anyone in authority: understanding. "Judge Hale," she said, her voice firmer now, "you might not have understood before, but now you see. You see that I'm not just some statistic. I'm not just a criminal to fine or forget. And maybe now you'll take a look at how people like me are treated by the system." She felt the weight of her words, but there was a part of her that finally felt heard. She had been carrying the invisible weight of her service for so long, hoping that someone would see her for more than just the woman in uniform, more than just the casualty of the system. And now, for the first time, someone had. Judge Hale nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said after a beat, his voice carrying a sincerity that made Lena's chest tighten. "I've been part of a system that doesn't always get it right. I've been blind to things I shouldn't have been. I'll make sure that your case gets reconsidered. I'll see to it that it's handled in a way that respects what you've given." Lena's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected him to go so far as to say those words, to take responsibility in a way that felt real. She didn't know what it would mean, whether the fine would be overturned or not, but hearing him say it was something that was far more important than the money. "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter now, the anger fading into something that felt like relief. Judge Hale gave a small nod, his eyes still locked with hers. For the first time in a long while, Lena didn't feel like she was fighting this battle alone. Over the next few weeks, Lena couldn't quite shake the feeling of unexpected relief that Judge Hale's words had given her. They hadn't been much, just a promise to reconsider her case, a few quiet words of understanding. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was invisible. She wasn't sure what had caused the shift in him, but something had changed. She found herself walking a little taller, standing a little straighter, and though her burdens hadn't magically disappeared, the weight of them felt a little lighter. It was a strange sensation, one she hadn't felt since her time in Iraq, when she had been surrounded by her fellow soldiers, when every action, every word had a meaning. Her phone buzzed one morning, pulling her from the haze of her thoughts. It was an email from the courthouse, something she hadn't expected to hear from again so soon. With tentative fingers, Lena opened it. "Dear Miss Thompson," the message began, "we are writing to inform you that your case is being reviewed for reconsideration. Judge Hale has personally requested a new hearing, and your fine will be reconsidered in light of your military service. Please expect a summons within the week." Lena read the message again, her heart racing. The words swam in front of her eyes. She wasn't sure if it was the sheer surprise of it, or the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was something more at play here. Maybe Judge Hale's apology wasn't just about that one fine. Maybe it was about the years of invisible service, the way she had been dismissed by the world she had fought to protect. But now he had seen her, truly seen her. And now he was doing something about it. The week that followed felt like a blur. Lena's days were filled with nervous anticipation. She didn't tell anyone about the email, not yet. She wasn't sure how they would react. Maybe they would think it was a fluke, or maybe they'd be skeptical of any change in a system that had let her down for so long. But this was different. This wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about her right to be seen for who she truly was. When the day of the hearing arrived, Lena stood in front of the courthouse again. But this time, it was different. She wasn't walking in with her head down, bracing herself for the cold reception. She wasn't expecting anything to be handed to her on a silver platter, but there was a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. The people around her still hurried by, lost in their own worlds, but she wasn't the same woman she had been that day. She had fought for more than just survival. She had fought for respect. And now she was walking in with that same resolve, that same spirit of resilience that had once carried her through the worst of the war. Judge Hale was already seated when she entered the courtroom. His posture was different now, less stern, less detached. It was as though the process of truly listening to her had opened something in him. When he saw her enter, He nodded, a small but meaningful gesture, before turning to address the court. "Miss Thompson," he began, his voice carrying more warmth than before. "We have reviewed your case, and after taking into account your service and the circumstances surrounding this violation, we have decided to waive the fine. You should not have been penalized in this way. We apologize for the oversight." Lena's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she didn't know what to say. She had expected to be given another chance, but this was more than she could have ever hoped for. It wasn't just about the fine. It was about the recognition of everything she had endured, everything she had sacrificed. She met Judge Hale's eyes and nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. The weight that had settled on her shoulders for so long finally began to lift, and for the first time in years, Lena felt like she could breathe again. The news of the waived fine spread quickly. To most people, it was just another court case resolved, another small victory in the larger scheme of things. But for Lena, it was so much more. It wasn't just about the fine being erased from her record, it was about her finally being seen, about the system that had once overlooked her finally recognizing the depth of her story. In the weeks that followed, Lena began to change. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but slowly she found herself feeling lighter, less burdened by the weight of being forgotten. She took long walks through the neighborhood, noticing things she hadn't before. The way the sun felt warm on her skin, the crispness in the air as autumn began to take hold. For the first time in ages, she allowed herself to enjoy the little moments, to let go of the constant anxiety that had followed her since her return from Iraq. It was as though the apology from Judge Hale had unlocked something inside of her, allowing her to heal in ways she hadn't thought possible. Her relationship with her family also started to shift. She had always kept her distance, never quite able to explain the things she had seen or felt. But after the hearing, after the validation, she found herself sitting with her mother more often, talking about her past and about what the future might hold. They had never been particularly close. Her mother had always been proud of her, but there had been a quiet distance, a space that Lena had filled with memories of war, memories of things that no one else could understand. But now it was different. There were no more walls between them. Lena could talk about her time in service without feeling like she was burdening anyone. She spoke about the faces of soldiers who had fallen beside her, about the hours spent stitching up wounds and comforting the wounded, about the bond she had shared with her comrades. Her mother listened without interruption, and for the first time, Lena didn't feel alone in her experience. Even with her new sense of connection, Lena knew that there was still work to do. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. There would be days when the shadows of war crept back into her mind, when the quiet would be broken by the echoes of explosions, when she would struggle to find a place in a world that seemed so disconnected from what she had lived. But she no longer felt like she was fighting that battle on her own. She had her family, her memories, and now, perhaps most importantly, she had her own sense of self-worth. She had found the courage to stand up for who she was, and she was no longer willing to be silenced. As for Judge Hale, he continued to make adjustments in how he treated veterans who came through his court. The experience of meeting Lena had changed him, and though the shift had been subtle, it was clear in his demeanor that he had learned something. He became more compassionate in his rulings, taking time to listen to the stories behind the cases, to see the people before the paperwork. One afternoon, Lena found herself back in the courthouse, though this time it was different. She was there not as someone being judged, but as someone who had come full circle. She had found the sense of peace that had eluded her for so long. As she left the courthouse that day, Lena took a deep breath and smiled. She knew that her journey wasn't over, that the road to healing was long and full of challenges, but she also knew something important. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, and that made all the difference.